like just taking off and just flying.
Whitney Houston sold over 200 million records, won 6 Grammys, and once held the record for 7 consecutive #1 hits. Her voice was so powerful it redefined pop music forever. But here is the shocking truth: behind that perfection, Whitney spent more than half her life battling addiction, collapsing in front of cameras watched by millions. This is not a story about fame or drugs. This is the journey from America's perfect voice to a slow, public self-destruction the world couldn't stop. In the early 1990s, Whitney Houston was untouchable. Her voice was considered flawless, studied by vocal coaches, admired by critics, and copied by an entire generation of singers. Every live performance sounded almost identical to the studio version. Perfect pitch. Perfect control. Perfect power. At her peak, she didn't just sing songs. She set the standard for what a great voice was supposed to be. But by the early 2000s, something terrifying began to unfold, slowly and publicly, in front of millions of people who had grown up worshipping that perfection. Television interviews showed her body drastically thinner. Her movements became restless. Her smile looked forced. When she spoke, there was exhaustion behind every word. And when she sang, something was missing. Notes cracked. Breath faded. Songs ended early. Concerts were canceled. Comebacks collapsed before they even began. What the public didn't realize at the time was that this wasn't a sudden downfall. Industry insiders would later confirm that Whitney had been battling addiction for more than a decade, long before tabloids caught on, long before headlines turned cruel. While she was winning awards, selling out arenas, and standing on the biggest stages in the world, she was already fighting a private war that never stopped. This is what makes her story so painful to watch. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It happened year after year, in real time, under bright lights and relentless cameras. There was no mystery. No shocking twist. Just a slow erosion of a woman who was expected to be perfect while she was quietly falling apart. By the time the world finally accepted that something was seriously wrong, it was already too late. Her name was still legendary. Her voice was still famous. But the person behind both had been exhausted for years. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't rebellion. It was a long, visible breakdown disguised as celebrity life. Whitney Houston was born in 1963 in Newark, New Jersey, a city shaped by racial tension, economic struggle, and quiet instability. It was not an environment designed for softness or safety. But inside her home, the atmosphere felt different. Music was always present. Gospel harmonies filled the rooms. Voices rehearsed. Songs became routine. From the outside, it looked like an extraordinary childhood surrounded by talent and opportunity. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a respected gospel singer with deep industry experience. She believed in discipline, precision, and excellence. She understood what it meant to survive as a black woman in music, and she understood how unforgiving the world could be. From a very early age, Whitney was taught how to sing correctly, how to control her voice, how to perform with confidence. Talent was not enough. Control mattered. Composure mattered. Perfection mattered. People noticed Whitney almost immediately. When she sang in church, adults stopped talking. Services paused. Attention shifted. She wasn't treated like a child discovering her voice. She was treated like a gift that needed to be protected, shaped, and presented. Compliments came often. Praise followed her everywhere. But questions about her inner world were rare. What she felt mattered far less than how she sounded. At home, emotional expression was limited. Pain was not something you explored openly. Fear was not something you admitted. Strength meant keeping it together. Love existed, but it was closely tied to behavior and performance. Approval followed obedience. Affection followed success. Over time, Whitney learned a quiet lesson that would shape her entire life: being exceptional was safer than being honest. Then came the trauma that changed everything. As a child, Whitney was sexually abused by someone she trusted, someone close enough to break her sense of safety without immediately being exposed. The experience was confusing, terrifying, and deeply isolating. She didn't have the words to explain what had happened. She didn't know how to ask for help. And in an environment where silence was already the norm, she learned to keep it inside. That silence stayed with her. It didn't disappear as she grew older. It hardened. It shaped how she related to her own emotions. What mattered wasn't only the abuse itself, but what Whitney learned from it. She learned how to disconnect from pain. She learned how to smile while hurting. She learned that showing vulnerability could cost her love. Her voice became the safest place she knew. When she sang, fear softened. When she performed, the world felt quieter. Music became escape. Applause became reassurance. Perfection became protection. Every compliment reinforced the idea that as long as she delivered excellence, nothing else would be asked of her. By her teenage years, Whitney was already performing regularly in church choirs, admired not just for her talent but for her composure. People spoke about her future with certainty. Fame felt inevitable. Greatness felt expected. But healing was never discussed. No one taught her how to process trauma. No one taught her how to sit with pain without running from it. Instead, the message remained consistent and unspoken: sing louder, smile wider, be flawless. This belief followed her into adulthood. What the world later celebrated as discipline was, at its core, self-protection. What fans admired as strength was a child who learned too early that love came with conditions. This was the foundation beneath the voice the world would fall in love with. A foundation built not on safety, but on survival. By the time Whitney Houston reached her late teens, her life was already orbiting around music, even if fame had not arrived yet. She didn't burst into the industry overnight. Her early career began quietly, almost invisibly. She sang background vocals. She recorded jingles. She stood behind other artists, learning how studios worked, how microphones responded, how professionalism mattered as much as talent. These were not glamorous years, but they were formative. They taught her one crucial lesson early on: excellence was expected, not celebrated. Whitney's voice opened doors quickly, but the industry didn't rush her forward without conditions. When Clive Davis first saw her perform, he recognized something rare. Not just raw talent, but discipline, control, and reliability. She wasn't unpredictable. She wasn't rebellious. She was safe. And in a business built on risk, safety was valuable. Whitney was signed to Arista Records and introduced to a carefully structured system designed to turn potential into global success. From the outside, it looked like destiny. From the inside, it felt like order. And order felt familiar. It echoed the environment she had grown up in, where structure replaced emotional safety and discipline replaced open conversation. Whitney didn't question it. She adapted. She listened. She learned how to be guided. Her debut album, released in 1985, reflected that approach perfectly. It was clean, polished, and accessible. There was no chaos in the sound. No danger in the image. Every song felt controlled, deliberate, and carefully chosen. The public responded immediately. Singles climbed the charts. Radio embraced her voice. Critics praised her technique. What mattered most was consistency. She delivered exactly what people expected, every time. But early success came with invisible pressure. Whitney was young, emotionally sensitive, and still carrying wounds she had never processed. Yet there was no room to slow down or reflect. Tours followed releases. Interviews followed tours. Expectations multiplied faster than she could understand them. Each achievement raised the bar, and each raised bar narrowed the space she had to be human. Behind the scenes, she learned how to suppress discomfort. Fatigue was ignored. Doubt was hidden. Fear was pushed aside. What the industry rewarded wasn't honesty or vulnerability. It rewarded performance. So Whitney performed, not just on stage, but in every aspect of her life. She became skilled at delivering perfection on demand. This period marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern. The more successful she became, the less room she had to explore who she actually was. Her identity fused with her output. Her worth became measurable. Applause turned into proof of value. Silence became something to avoid. The world saw a young artist rising gracefully. What it didn't see was how quickly the pace erased any chance of emotional grounding. Whitney didn't step into fame gradually. She was pulled into it, guided by people who believed they were protecting her by controlling the environment around her. And in many ways, they were right. The system worked. The results were undeniable. But something important was missing. There was no space for healing. No room for imperfection. No pause to address the pain she had learned to bury. Success arrived faster than self-understanding. And while her career was accelerating, her inner life was quietly left behind. This was not a mistake. It was a design. And it would shape everything that came next. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Whitney Houston was no longer an emerging artist. She was a phenomenon. Her rise was not gradual or uncertain. It was decisive. Singles reached #1 and stayed there. Albums sold in numbers most artists never touched in an entire career. Awards followed quickly, then relentlessly. What made it remarkable was not just the success, but the consistency. Whitney didn't fluctuate. She dominated. Her voice became a cultural reference point. Vocal coaches studied it. Young singers imitated it. Critics described it as technically flawless. Every live performance reinforced the same message: she was dependable. In an industry defined by unpredictability, Whitney represented control. She could be trusted to deliver perfection on demand, night after night, city after city. That reliability made her invaluable, not only to record labels, but to the image of pop music itself. The media played a central role in shaping her myth. Whitney was presented as the ideal star. Clean image. Elegant presence. No controversy. She wasn't marketed as rebellious or edgy. She was framed as reassuring. Parents approved of her. Broadcasters embraced her. Brands aligned with her. She became proof that superstardom didn't have to be dangerous or chaotic. She was the exception that reassured the system. One moment crystallized this image more than any other. In 1991, she performed the national anthem at the Super Bowl. It wasn't treated as just another performance. It became an event. Her voice was powerful, controlled, and emotionally precise. The performance was replayed endlessly, praised across political and cultural lines, and absorbed into the national memory. In that moment, Whitney wasn't just a singer. She was a symbol. America's voice. With that level of visibility came an entirely new scale of pressure. Every appearance carried expectation. Every note was judged against the memory of her best work. There was no room for experimentation. No space for growth through failure. She wasn't allowed to be inconsistent or unfinished. The world didn't want evolution. It wanted repetition of perfection. Behind the applause, isolation grew. Touring became routine. Hotels blurred together. Schedules left little room for rest or reflection. Praise lost its meaning because it never stopped. Success stopped feeling like achievement and started feeling like obligation. Whitney was admired everywhere, yet increasingly alone within her own life. The image of greatness left little room for the person underneath. Emotionally, the disconnect deepened. The same discipline that had helped her succeed now prevented her from slowing down. There was no pause to ask how she was coping. The assumption was simple: if she kept delivering, she must be fine. Strength was inferred from output. Silence was mistaken for stability. Her personal life became harder to separate from the public image. Every relationship was scrutinized. Every choice was filtered through expectation. The pressure to remain flawless didn't disappear when she left the stage. It followed her everywhere. She learned to stay composed even when she felt overwhelmed, because composure was what people rewarded. The paradox of this period was cruel. These were the years most artists dream of. Global recognition, financial security, cultural dominance. And yet, this was also when Whitney felt increasingly disconnected from herself. The higher she rose, the more distant her inner world became. She had achieved everything she was supposed to achieve, yet the sense of safety she had been chasing never arrived. This wasn't visible to the public. On the surface, the story was perfect. Whitney Houston was winning. She was setting records. She was admired across generations. There was no obvious reason for concern. But beneath the image, the cost of perfection was accumulating quietly. Her voice carried stadiums, but it was also carrying expectations far heavier than anyone acknowledged. The world saw strength. What it didn't see was how exhausting it was to never be allowed to rest, to never be allowed to be ordinary, to never be allowed to struggle out loud. This was the peak of her career. The moment her legacy was cemented. And it was also the moment when the distance between who Whitney appeared to be and who she actually was became unsustainable. Without realizing it, she had reached a height that left no safe way down. At the height of her fame, when success looked absolute and unshakable, Whitney Houston was quietly unraveling. The pressure to remain perfect never paused. It followed her off stage, into hotel rooms, onto private flights, and through long nights where silence felt heavier than noise. Every public appearance reinforced the same expectation: she had to be flawless. There was no room for uncertainty, no permission to be exhausted, and no language for pain. This was the environment in which her personal life became entangled with her need for escape. Whitney met Bobby Brown at a moment when she was already carrying more weight than her success suggested. He represented the opposite of the world she had been trained to survive in. Where Whitney was controlled, he was chaotic. Where she was polished, he was raw. With him, she didn't have to perform perfection. She could be loud, emotional, and unpredictable. That freedom felt intoxicating. The relationship moved quickly and intensely. Love and conflict blurred together until they were inseparable. What looked like passion from the outside often functioned as distraction on the inside. Within that dynamic, Whitney found relief from the constant pressure to be composed. But relief came with a cost. Instability became normal. Boundaries disappeared. Emotional dependence deepened. Drugs entered her life not as rebellion, but as regulation. They quieted anxiety. They softened memories she had never learned how to process. They dulled expectations that never loosened their grip. For Whitney, addiction was not about excess or thrill. It was about silence. It was about feeling less when feeling everything had become unbearable. For years, this struggle remained mostly hidden. On stage, she still delivered moments of brilliance. In interviews, she still smiled. The system around her continued to function as long as results appeared. But behind closed doors, her body and mind were deteriorating. Sleep became irregular. Mood swings intensified. The discipline that once protected her now trapped her in denial. As the marriage deteriorated, the damage became harder to contain. Arguments escalated. Trust eroded. Dependency replaced stability. Yet Whitney continued to work, continued to tour, continued to meet expectations that no longer matched her reality. The pace didn't slow. If anything, it accelerated. Success demanded continuity, not reflection. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the cracks were visible to anyone willing to look. Performances became inconsistent. Interviews felt defensive. Her appearance changed dramatically. When confronted, she denied the extent of her struggle. Not because she believed the denial, but because admitting the truth felt dangerous. Her entire identity had been built on control. Losing it publicly felt like losing everything. The public didn't know how to respond. Confusion turned into speculation. Speculation turned into ridicule. The media shifted from admiration to surveillance. Every appearance was dissected. Every rumor amplified. Whitney was no longer covered for her talent alone, but for signs of collapse. And instead of pulling back, the spotlight intensified. What made this period especially tragic was that help existed, but trust did not. Years of conditioning had taught Whitney that vulnerability led to rejection. That weakness cost love. That honesty endangered stability. So she kept performing. She kept smiling. She kept protecting the image that had once protected her. This wasn't a sudden breakdown. It was a slow erosion. A woman trained to survive through perfection was now trapped by it. The voice that had carried her to the top could no longer shield her from the weight she carried inside. And while the world watched more closely than ever, the space for compassion continued to shrink. As the decline became impossible to hide, the tone of public attention changed. Performances that once felt effortless now looked fragile. High notes were avoided. Songs were shortened. Applause sounded cautious instead of electric. Each appearance raised more questions than answers, and the media stopped celebrating talent and started documenting deterioration. Cameras followed Whitney Houston not to capture greatness, but to catch mistakes. Television interviews grew tense and uncomfortable. Her laughter felt forced. Her answers sounded guarded. When asked directly about drug use, she denied it publicly, not with confidence, but with fear. These moments were not calculated lies meant to manipulate the audience. They were defenses. Admitting the truth would have meant admitting weakness, and weakness had always felt unsafe. For someone conditioned to believe that love was conditional, honesty felt like loss. As scrutiny intensified, sympathy thinned. Late-night shows mocked her appearance. Headlines reduced her life to punchlines. The same culture that once praised her discipline now punished her for losing control. Because the collapse unfolded slowly, it became normalized. There was no single moment that demanded compassion, only a series of moments that trained the public to watch without intervening. Psychologically, the pattern was devastatingly clear. Trauma that is never processed does not disappear. It waits. Childhood wounds buried beneath success resurface under pressure. For Whitney, fame didn't create the pain. It magnified it. The constant demand for perfection eliminated any space to rest, reflect, or heal. Addiction became a coping mechanism, not a choice. Denial became a form of survival. Attempts to regain stability were complicated by the environment around her. Each effort was framed as a comeback, measured against an impossible standard, her former peak. Progress that didn't look spectacular was dismissed as failure. Recovery was treated like performance, expected to produce immediate results. Patience was scarce. Understanding was limited. The pressure to prove strength returned before strength could rebuild. By the early 2000s, her physical and emotional reserves were depleted. Confidence eroded. Trust in people weakened. Even when she tried to step back, the world refused to let her disappear quietly. Expectations followed her everywhere. The narrative demanded redemption, not recovery. And redemption required visibility, which kept the wound open. This was the cruelest contradiction of her story. She needed privacy to heal, but her identity had been built entirely in public. She needed permission to be unfinished, but the world only valued her when she appeared whole. What audiences interpreted as failure was often exhaustion. What critics labeled self-destruction was frequently untreated pain colliding with relentless exposure. There was no villain here in the traditional sense. No single person or moment to blame. The tragedy lived in the system that rewarded silence, punished vulnerability, and consumed perfection until there was nothing left to take. Whitney did not collapse because she lacked strength. She collapsed because she was never allowed to stop being strong. By the time compassion resurfaced, the damage was already deep. The voice that once defined excellence now carried the weight of disappointment, not just her own, but the world's. And while millions watched, analyzed, and judged, the space for genuine care continued to shrink. What remained was not a scandal, but a lesson. A reminder that watching someone fall slowly does not make us innocent. And that admiration without protection can be just as destructive as hatred. At some point, denial stops working. For Whitney Houston, that point did not arrive as a single dramatic realization. It came as exhaustion that could no longer be hidden. Physical fatigue settled into her bones. Emotional numbness replaced adrenaline. The body that had carried her voice across decades began to resist the pace it had been forced to keep. Confidence gave way to hesitation, and the strategies that once helped her survive started to fail. Recovery entered her life not as a clean reset, but as a series of difficult attempts. Rehab, therapy, and distance from the chaos that had defined her private world followed. She separated from Bobby Brown, ending a relationship that had once felt like escape but had long turned into damage. For the first time in years, the noise softened. There was space. Not peace, but space. And within that space, Whitney tried to remember who she was without constant performance. This was when the comeback narrative took control of the story. Every appearance was framed as a return. Every performance was judged against the memory of her peak. The public wanted proof that discipline could undo years of damage, that strength alone could restore perfection. But healing does not work on schedules. It does not move backward. And it does not recreate what existed before. The reality was quieter, slower, and far less dramatic than the headlines promised. Whitney understood this, even if the world did not. She began to speak more honestly in interviews, acknowledging fear, mistakes, and limits. These admissions were not signs of weakness. They were moments of clarity. She was no longer chasing the version of herself that had satisfied everyone else. She was chasing stability. That distinction mattered, even if it disappointed those who wanted spectacle instead of truth. Musically, she tried to return on her own terms. Albums were recorded. Performances were planned. The voice was different. The stamina was different. The control that once felt effortless now required caution. Each step forward came with reminders of what had been lost. The world measured her against an impossible standard, while she measured herself against survival. The two perspectives never aligned. Progress came unevenly. Strength appeared alongside fragility. Hope existed, but it was fragile. The pressure to be back collided with the reality that some wounds leave permanent marks. Whitney was not failing to recover. She was confronting the depth of her damage without the armor of perfection for the first time in her life. That confrontation was painful, slow, and often misunderstood. What made this period especially difficult was the absence of patience. Recovery was treated like performance, expected to produce immediate and visible results. Setbacks were framed as proof of weakness. Quiet improvements went unnoticed. The environment that had once demanded perfection now demanded redemption, and redemption required visibility. Privacy, which she needed to heal, remained out of reach. Still, there were moments of dignity. Moments when Whitney spoke about self-worth beyond success. Moments when she emphasized love over achievement. Moments when it became clear that she understood what fame had taken from her, even if she could not undo it. These were not triumphant declarations. They were honest reflections from someone learning, too late, how much of herself she had sacrificed to survive. This phase of her life was not a dramatic rebirth. It was an attempt. An effort to live without hiding. An effort to exist without performing every moment. The world wanted miracles. Whitney was learning how to rest. The difference between those two expectations defined the tension of her final years. In that struggle, there was courage. There was humility. And there was a quiet refusal to keep pretending. Even when the voice no longer carried the power it once did, telling the truth about her pain mattered more than hitting every note. For someone who had been rewarded for silence her entire life, that honesty was its own kind of victory. This was not the comeback people wanted. But it was the most human chapter of her story. In the final years of her life, Whitney Houston moved through the world with a quieter presence. The pace slowed, not by choice, but by necessity. Appearances became selective. Energy was carefully rationed. To the public, she looked fragile. To those close to her, she looked exhausted in a deeper way, the kind of tiredness that sleep alone cannot repair. Decades of living under expectation had left little room for ease. Her relationship with music had changed. Singing was no longer effortless refuge. It demanded caution, patience, and acceptance of limits she had never needed to face before. There was grief in that realization. Music had been her armor, her escape, her proof of worth. Now it reflected reality back to her. Even so, she continued. Not to reclaim glory, but because letting go entirely felt like disappearing. When an identity is built around performance, silence can feel more frightening than struggle. Public reaction remained divided. Some audiences held on to the memory of her peak and struggled to accept anything less. Others watched with sympathy, sensing the weight she carried. The narrative oscillated between hope and disappointment, between nostalgia and scrutiny. What rarely appeared was patience. The world still measured her against perfection, even when she had clearly moved beyond chasing it. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in a hotel bathtub in Beverly Hills. She was 48 years old. The news spread instantly, followed by shock, grief, and an overwhelming sense of inevitability. For many, it felt sudden. For others, it felt like the final chapter of a story that had been unraveling quietly for years. There was no grand farewell. No staged ending. Just silence. In the days that followed, the public response revealed a painful contradiction. Tributes poured in. Performances were replayed. Her voice filled the airwaves again, restored to its most powerful moments. In death, she was returned to perfection. The struggle softened. The complexity was simplified. The messiness of her life was edited out, replaced by highlight reels and reverent praise. But Whitney's legacy cannot be reduced to flawless notes or record-breaking numbers. She left behind more than timeless music. She left a lesson about what happens when talent is nurtured but trauma is ignored, when discipline is rewarded but vulnerability is discouraged. Her life exposed the cost of being admired without being protected, of being celebrated without being understood. Her influence on music is undeniable. Generations of singers studied her phrasing, her control, her emotional precision. She set a standard that reshaped pop and R&B vocals. Yet her deeper impact lies beyond technique. It lives in conversations about mental health, about addiction as untreated pain, about the danger of demanding perfection from human beings. Whitney Houston's story forces a difficult reflection. Greatness does not cancel humanity. Success does not erase wounds. And strength, when it leaves no room for rest, eventually becomes unsustainable. Her voice will always be remembered as one of the greatest ever recorded. But her life matters because it reminds us that even the strongest voices can be exhausted. What remains is not just admiration, but responsibility. To listen more closely. To protect more carefully. To understand that behind every image of success, there is a person carrying something unseen. Whitney's legacy asks us to do better, not only as fans, but as witnesses. The story of Whitney Houston leaves behind more than music. It leaves a question that is uncomfortable but necessary. How much strength do we demand from people before we notice the cost? Whitney was celebrated for her control, her discipline, her perfection. Yet the same qualities that made her great also taught her to stay silent when she needed help the most. Her life reminds us that talent does not protect anyone from pain. Success does not heal trauma. And being admired does not mean being safe. For years, the world praised her for holding it together, mistaking silence for stability and performance for well-being. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, the damage had already taken root. This is not a story about drugs, fame, or failure. It is a story about pressure. About what happens when vulnerability is treated as weakness and perfection becomes a requirement instead of a goal. Whitney did not disappear because she lacked strength. She disappeared because she was never given space to be human without consequence. Her voice will always stand among the greatest in history. But her deeper legacy lives in what her journey teaches us. To listen beyond applause. To value honesty over image. To understand that resilience without care eventually breaks. The story does not end with her. It turns back to us. Because behind every success, every achievement, every image of strength, there is a human being carrying something unseen. So what's your story?